We're going to wrap up Romans today. It's the last week. We'll be looking in the book of Romans. Some of you are cheering, some of you are sad. I've been hearing lots of good feedback about doing that this summer, but we're going to move on after this. But we're wrapping up Romans, looking in the last couple chapters here this morning and Paul's talking about food. And I was thinking about that. We don't necessarily have, what he was talking about was, what's kosher to eat and what's not kosher to eat, because you had Gentile Christians and Jewish Christians. So I think, do we have that problem today? Because most of us grew up kind of meat and potatoes. How many people here are what kind of meat and potatoes people? You just grew up meat and potatoes, right? But today, there's like all these categories of people and how they eat. Have you noticed that recently? It's become become new. So I started to try and figure all this out. So thanks to Google, I came up with all the different types of vegetarians. Because you've got vegetarian, right? But really, it's all different. And here, don't worry, I'm going to explain all these to you. Don't worry. So here are the different categories and different ways that people have made conscious decisions. That's what Paul's talking about. It's a matter of conscience. So a vegetarian may be a vegetarian for a matter of conscience. So first of all, there's the flexitarian. Now, a flexitarian is a vegetarian that sometimes eats meat. Okay, so you got that? I used to be a flexitarian when I was doing training and things like that. I used to be a flexitarian. Then Mission Barbecue opened, and I became a back to meat and potatoes kind of guy, right? So I'm no longer a flexitarian. Now, a pescatarian is someone who is a vegetarian that eats only fish. That's the only meat they eat is fish. Then there's the lacto-ovo vegetarian, which is your traditional vegetarian. Now, that vegetarian eats both dairy and eggs and is a vegetarian. Then your ovo-vegetarian is someone who doesn't eat dairy, but eats eggs and vegetables, right? You with me so far? And then there's the vegan. Now, the vegan is different than the vegetarian. A vegan is a vegetarian that does not eat dairy or eggs, so that's why they're not lacto, ovo, or ovo-vegetarian. They're vegan. But that's not the end of it. So then there are also people who are raw vegans. That means they only eat raw vegetables and fruits and nuts and grains and nothing cooked over 115 degrees Fahrenheit. And then the new one I learned about this week, so I kind of knew all those in my head, but the last one I found out about was the macrobiotic. Did you know about the macrobiotic? Some of you are like, yeah, I've heard of this. I'm like, I've never heard of this before. But this is a vegetarian-style diet. But this diet only eats unprocessed vegan foods. So if the vegan food it may be vegan, meaning it's not dairy, meat, or egg related, but if it's processed in any way, they don't eat it. So only natural. So they eat a lot of seaweed and things of that nature, and so it can't be processed. But they do eat some particular fish. So it's kind of like a pescatarian, but a certain kind of vegetarian. I don't know how to explain it, but that's the best way I can do for you. So what do you do when somebody who fits into one of these, who has a conscience about one of these types of eating habits, what do you do when they come over for dinner? Especially if you're a meat and potatoes person, right? You don't serve them steak, right? You start to take their diet into consideration. You're trying to be welcoming and hospitable, and you're trying to work with them because you're trying to honor their conscience. That's what Paul's talking about here in Romans. And we're going to talk about how that looks like, because that's really about what it means to live in Christian community. That's the purpose of Christian community. The purpose of Christian community is to live together, as Paul says, in harmony and peace, to work together, to respect each other's faith and conscience. That's the purpose. To live in Christian community. Now, if you remember, throughout this whole series, we've been talking about the triangle of relationships. Our relationship to God, that's us, God. Paul talked about that several chapters, about God's grace, our sin, our need for restoration, redemption. When that happens, then that changes me. Then that changes how I relate to other people and how I love them, because I know I'm loved by God. And so you've got that side of the triangle, then the bottom of the triangle. But today we're talking about the other side of the triangle on the right. Paul's talking about other people's relationship to God. What he's talking about in this passage is that you and I need to be aware of their relationship, their faith to God, and how we're impacting and influencing it, and what we're doing or not doing that may help them in their relationship with God. That's why Paul's talking about this, because part of what was happening was that the Gentile Christians in Rome were saying, hey, we can eat whatever we want. And the Jewish Christians in Rome were saying, no, we're following the kosher law. We've got to follow the kosher law in our church because we can only eat certain meats, and we're to stick to, they couldn't eat pork and they couldn't eat shellfish. And so they had this specialized diet. And so there was a debate going on. And so Paul's saying, first of all, be careful what you bring to the potluck, Just think about what you're bringing to the church potluck. That's what he's talking about. They didn't have potlucks back then, but I think they probably did. They just didn't call it potluck. So what he's saying, though, is consider the other person's conscience, their faith, their relationship to God. And I also want to be clear that Paul's talking here not about essential faith issues. He's talking about religious practice. And I think we have to be clear about that. There are certain essentials that we hold tightly to and we would kind of go to our grave on. But these are non-essentials, what we call non-essentials. These are matters of conscience and practice. And so it's not that we're to live at peace with other Christians that may practice different than we do. So for example, vegetarian, pescatarian, flexitarian, we heard about that. Have you ever heard of Presbyterian, Episcopalian, Wesleyan, Pentecostal, right? Baptist, you've heard of those, right? What are they describing? Categories of practice. So for the most part, if I go run into a Presbyterian, the Presbyterian and I pretty much agree on the essentials, in the essentials of theology, faith, orthodoxy. So we can be very similar in our theology in a lot of ways, but our practice is different. Or if I go to an Episcopal church, they worship in a different practice than I worship here in the Methodist church in practice. And so what Paul is saying is, look, we're all going to practice differently our faith. We're not to judge one another because someone practices in these non-essential areas different than we do. In fact, we're supposed to pursue Christian community. We're supposed to live in harmony with them. So that's what Paul's talking about. It's not about the essentials, but about the non-essential practices that we encounter. The other thing is, so how do we do that? But the real concern is, am I thinking not only of myself, but am I thinking about that other person's relationship to God? And is that my concern? Do I love people? Do I love God's people? That's the question. It's Paul's raising in a roundabout way. We have a great golf tournament here at Glenmar. And, the question, even not only golf tournaments, but other places is, well, should we serve alcohol? Because we as a church, if you come to a church dinner here, we never serve alcohol. We as a church don't serve alcohol. But sometimes when we're other places that do serve alcohol, the golf course wants to serve alcohol, even though we as a church are not serving the alcohol, but the golf course wants to make money serving alcohol, and so we've always got this little dilemma going on. And and I personally, so having a beer, having a glass of wine, that's not sinful behavior. It's not a sin to have a beer. It's not a sin to have a glass of wine. Paul always identifies sin as drunkenness in the Bible. But I want you to think about this. There are some people that don't believe that as a matter of conscience that they shouldn't drink. And a good example of that was actually at a golf tournament at another church a few years ago. We had a golf outing, golf tournament, and we as the church didn't serve beer, but the golf course. If you've ever played golf, how many people have ever played golf? By the way, a lot of golfers here. Yeah, okay. So when you're at the golf course, there's this cart that goes around the course with beverages, all kinds of beverages, right? And it goes around the course as you're playing golf, and it sells beverages to the golfers. And beer, wine, Gatorade, Coke, whatever. And so this particular day, we're on the outing, and after the golf tournament's over, this gentleman comes up to me, and he's upset. And his first response to me is, I can't believe that we as a church would serve alcohol at our golf tournament. And I said, well, we as the church, are not serving the alcohol. The golf course is serving the alcohol. And so, we started getting this little debate. And then I thought, but sometimes as a pastor, you have to step back and listen to what's really going on. And so instead of me just saying, hey, this is right or wrong, or we could debate this non-essential practice of the faith, I said to him, what is it that bothers you most about this? Like, tell me really what's going on here. And that's when he got vulnerable with me. And the next thing he said to me, he says, I'm a recovering alcoholic. And me just smelling the beer that the other guys were drinking was a temptation for me. And I'm struggling right now with wanting to go grab a six-pack of beer on my way home. And I don't want to do that, Pastor. And I thought, oh my. And my next response was, I am so sorry that we put you in that situation. Because as a Christian community, we should be guarding and protecting you and helping you not to stumble, helping you not to fall, helping you not to mess up. We want to support you in your relationship to God. We want to support you in your faith, and I want to make sure this never happens again for you. So that's where this idea comes in. That's a good example, a modern day example of how we're to consider that other person's relationship to God and not just what we think is okay or what we think is right or what we think is a good, maybe a practice for us, but we don't realize the impact it may have on somebody else and how it might impact their faith and how it might impact their relationship to God or their struggle with sin. That's what Paul's talking about. If we love people, then we're going to take into consideration how that relationship with God. And he kind of sums up a lot of what he's talking about in verse 19 when he says, let us then pursue what makes for peace and for mutual upbuilding. So the first thing Paul's saying to us as a Christian community, and says that the mark of a Christian community is that people in that community, they pursue peace with one another. They pursue to live in peace with one another. They don't seek to argue and quarrel and debate and judge. They seek to be at peace with one another and live in harmony and relationship to one another. That's the heart of the Christian community. That one person is going to say, I'm going to love you enough to want to see you grow in your faith, and I'm going to love you enough not to put any stumbling blocks or obstacles in your way that may be a matter of your conscience, whether it be about food or drinking or whatever else it might be. So let's honor that other person, respect that other person's conscience. And then he says, so that if we're like this peace-loving community, then how would that change? If you knew that we had vegetarians and flexitarians and vegans in our church, how would that change our potluck? What would you do? What would you do differently if you knew that when you came to the potluck? Not that we have potlucks, but just go with me here. I'm going to let you respond. What would you do? I'd bring more veggies, right. What else would you do? I know this actually happened. I would suggest you go ask the person, right? Hey, understand you're vegetarian. I understand you're a vegan. What can you eat? What is it that I can do? How can I help with this, right? So if somebody were coming to your house for dinner, you'd certainly ask them about their eating habits, right? You wouldn't, if a vegetarian was coming over to your house, you wouldn't serve steak, right? Rare steak. That's not something you would probably serve them off the grill because you were trying to live at peace with them, right? Now, the other thing I would also expect that when that person came to dinner is that they would not give me a lecture on why I shouldn't eat meat. I'm going to Mission Barbecue after you leave my dinner, so please, don't give me a lecture on why I shouldn't do it. See, they're not judging me and I'm not judging them. I'm trying to honor their conscience and they're not imposing their conscience upon me. And that's about how we live at peace with one another, especially in these non-essential areas. The other thing that Paul is saying is not only to pursue peace, but we're to pursue mutual upbuilding. Mutual upbuilding. That means that last week we talked about mutual yielding, mutual love for one another, how it's reciprocal, and how that really helps. In the Christian community, when we're all seeking to build each other up, encourage each other, build each other up in the faith, then we're not seeking to tear each other down, right? Judging people tears them down. And so we're not to do that. We're supposed to be building them up. That's what Paul says. that our primary concern is their faith in God. And I'm always having to think about, how can I help build this person's faith? You know, every time I get up here and preach on Sundays, Saturdays, I'm thinking about you all. I'm thinking, how can I help the people in this room, in this sanctuary, grow in their faith? How can I help you get closer to God? How can I build you up in some way? Sometimes I have to address things that don't feel good, but it's always with the purpose of building up and growing you in your faith. Are you thinking about that as you encounter other people? As you deal with other people? Are you thinking about their faith in God, their relationship to God? I had a discussion with a gentleman just recently who hasn't gone to church for 5 years. And the wonderful thing about being a pastor is you find out all the reasons why. I sat down and I talked with this gentleman, and he was telling me the reason that he left his church. It was one of those other, brand churches. It wasn't a Methodist church. It was, I won't tell you what denomination it was. But they left the church. He had left the church, hadn't gone back for 5 years, and so I started to listen to his story. And I won't tell you his story because it's a personal story, but I will tell you there are 2 things that jumped out about his story that I've heard in many, many other stories like his. The first thing that happened to him was he felt judged by his congregation. And it wasn't over anything important. It usually isn't, folks. It's not it wasn't over anything essential. It was something that was non-essential. It was something about a business decision that he had made, and people didn't agree with him. So they judged him. But he kept going to church, even though these people were judging him and talking about him behind his back and doing all these things that don't mark the Christian community. And then he said, the reason I left the church was because I came to the realization that nobody here loved me. Why would I want to worship with people who don't love me, who don't care about me and my family? So I left. And I never went back. And I don't go to church anywhere. And so I said to him, you can come to Glenmar, right? Where people will love you and people will encourage you. So I was trying to still build, even though I knew all these things were happening, I wanted him to be back in relationship with God. Not that he has to go to church to do that all the time, but I think the church helps. So basically I was trying to encourage him in his faith and say, don't give up on your faith just because of other people, how people treated you. So I was trying to help him. And that's really what Paul goes on to say about our God, that our God is marked by 2 things. And he says that in verse 15:5. He says, may the God of steadfastness and encouragement grant you to live in harmony with one another. Now here's the thing, folks. I think these 2 things, steadfastness and encouragement, will bring harmony. So that if we're living in the way that God would live in towards other people, with steadfastness and encouragement, that'll help build people up. That's the 1-2 punch of upbuilding, mutual upbuilding, is steadfastness and encouragement. So what's steadfastness? Steadfastness is sticking by somebody no matter what. It's your commitment to them. And really what Paul's talking about is your commitment to their relationship with God and seeing their relationship with God and saying, I'm going to stick by you even when you mess up, and get you back to God, or help you, encourage you to get back to God, or help you in your faith. So a steadfast person is not going to just write a person off when they make a mistake or do something they disagree with. They're not going to distance themselves from them or give up on them or not be in a relationship with them anymore. What they're going to do is they're going to stay with them. They're going to be steadfast. They're going to be sticking to them and loving them no matter what. That's steadfastness. The other piece of it is encouragement. Now, what is encouragement? It literally means to put courage into someone. So what am I doing to put courage into someone? And why do people need courage? Why do people need courage? What do they need that for? Come on, you know it. It's very easy. Isn't it because they're afraid? Isn't that the moment that people need courage, is when they're afraid of something? when I talk to people outside the church, I'm always hearing this. I'm afraid to come to church. You know, that's really what they're saying. I'm afraid to be a part of that community because I'm afraid. You know what they're afraid of? They'll judge me. They won't accept me. They won't love me. So I'm just not even going to go. I'm not even going to participate because I'm not sure. I'm afraid of what might happen when I get there. So that's what they're afraid. So what are we as Christians to be doing in the community? We're supposed to be encouraging, putting courage into them to have this relationship to God, to grow their relationship with God. That's what encouragement does. So, and that's exactly what I was trying to do with that gentleman I just told you about. What was I trying to do? I was encouraging him to continue his relationship with God, grow in his faith, find ways to do that. He didn't need to go back to the church that he felt injured by for that to happen, but he did need to go somewhere else, and he needed to get involved in a Christian community somewhere else, somehow, some way. And really, Paul sums this up, is that because when we're injuring others, Paul says actually there in chapter 14, says, when we're injuring other people, whether intentional or unintentional, we're not walking in love. That's what Paul says. We're not walking in love. And when we're in Christian community, we're to be walking in love. There was a man who was a holy man, and he was out along a river meditating on the scriptures one day. And as he was meditating, he was noticing that the waters at the river he was sitting by were rising, and he was sitting under this beautiful tree, and the tree's roots along the riverbank stretched out into the river. And those roots got water from the river. And so he noticed that as he looked down, there was a scorpion stuck out on one of the roots as the river water was rising. So the holy man, seeing this, he kind of shimmied out onto the roots and was holding onto the root, reaching over to try and rescue the scorpion from the floodwaters. And what do scorpions do when you try and grab them? They sting, right? And so he was doing that. He was trying to find a way to grab the scorpion. Every time he tried to grab the scorpion would try and sting him, and this was going on for a little while. And another observer walked by and looked at the holy man and just kind of shook his head like, what is this guy doing? He says, don't you know that it's in the scorpion's nature to sting you? And the holy man responded, he says, yeah, I know that. But should I change my nature to love just because he won't change his nature? And he continued to help. That's the mark of God. God doesn't change God's nature to love and to encourage and to be steadfast even when others don't. That's what God did in Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ left heaven, left his throne in heaven, left his home in heaven to become human. Not only did he give up his heavenly home, but he also gave up his humanity as well, and he became considered a criminal that they crucified on a cross. And he wasn't doing that because he was afraid that people wouldn't love him back. He did that because that was his nature. That is God's nature, to love us even when we try to injure. That's God's nature, and the Christian community is to reflect that God. And what are we considered? We're considered the body of Christ. We're to reflect Christ's love, sacrificial love for others. And so when we love other people sacrificially, when we walk in sacrificial love, we will be thinking not of ourselves, but we will be thinking about that other person's faith in God and how we can help them to grow and to know God and to love God themselves, just like we do. Amen.